Thanks. I'm happy to be here. My name is Laura Koesten, and Ted asked me to speak to you about some of the work we've been doing in the area of human data interaction. About myself, I'm a research fellow at King's College London. I work with Professor Eleanor Simple in the Department of Informatics in the Distributed Artificial Intelligence group. So really, I don't have much experience with environmental data, but I did study how people work with data in many different contexts and different domains. And in my research, I'm really looking at how people interact with technology and specifically with data. Okay, let me see if I can actually change my slide. No? No, okay. So I'm part of a research project that's called Data Stories, which has been going on for more than 3 years, in which we looked at what it is that makes data engaging for different types of audiences. And we draw on methods from different disciplines, including things like how to bring data to people through arts, games, and also storytelling. So essentially we try and work on solutions that help make data more relevant, more interactive, more easily shared, and more inclusive. And I'm just going to use the next 20 minutes to go over the context of this work. And I'm going to share 3 study areas with you that we looked at that I thought could be relevant to the discussions we're going to have today and tomorrow, and how such research could be translated to practice or to guidelines that sort of influence how we publish, document, and represent data, also data that's of public interest. So I'll focus on the outcomes of our studies to kind of give an overview, but if you are interested and want to know more about the methods and how we got there and the context, there's going to be some time for questions afterwards, or you can just ping me. I think we really all agree here that data is an important part of our daily lives. It shapes our understanding of the world and it informs the decisions we make. And so some of the questions we've been asking ourselves in this project is how do people go on and find and select data that is online? What actually happens when we look at new data, and how do we put data into context, understand it, or decide whether it's useful or trustworthy? So really all these questions are related to what makes interaction with data unique, and how can users and discussions about data be supported by tools and by infrastructure. So how did we get there? I'm not going to go into detail about this, but we use multiple research methods, usually mixed methods, over about 4 years. And I think the one thing I want to point out is that we talk to a large number of data users who were partially data professionals, or were researchers or scientists, but also people who consider themselves to be amateurs or beginners, or simply domain experts who have some experience with data but are not like professional data scientists. So the first project I'm going to talk about relates to the question of how people find and select data. And really we looked at how can you support dataset search currently. And for this we tried and understand how people currently go on about finding data. And so, I mean, you probably know there are data portals. This is a screenshot of data.gov.uk. This is a governmental data portal in the UK. Then there is also, since last year, there's been Google Dataset Search, where you can specifically search for datasets online. And I've done a kind of quick and naive search for flood data yesterday, and I found things. Found quite a lot of data, which is obviously not the case for every topic. But what I really thought is, let's stop searching. There's going to be people at this event who will tell me where the data sits, what data sets make sense to look at, and why. And so I'm not going to waste my time with going through the stuff I found there. And I'm telling the story because this was really what we also found in a study on dataset search. So we found that despite data search engines, data portals, really people rely heavily on human recommendation. And I think that's partially because there isn't a lot of easily accessible information about data sets out there that A tells us where it is, and then B tells us what it is and what it can be used for and what it actually contains. And so obviously there is metadata, there are data set descriptions, but there are also people who try and decide on a data set and whether a data set that they find, like for example, this one here, is what they want to find. And so one of the outcomes of our studies was kind of data set specific selection criteria, which is really where we tried to see what are the differences if people try to select textual documents or posted data sets. And for just to pick one example, obviously, if you have a data set, whether you can access it or not, or whether it's big enough, too big for you to download and to use for whatever tool you're using is relevant before you decide whether you can work with data or not. And in one of our studies, we were trying to understand what would a data set description that would be something like you see here on the screen and the description, it's like a text about a data set. What would such a description look like if it were to fulfill all these selection criteria? And this is an example of a common type of description that's really not very detailed. And so we let people describe data sets in 50 to 100 word paragraphs, and we did that in a crowdsourcing experiment and in a lab experiment, and kind of sort of counted and extracted the most common attributes that people think are worthy of telling other people when they're summarizing a data set. This is what such an annotated data set summary would look like. And this is really just to give an overview, from something like this, we produced a dataset summarization template. And these are just 9 questions that, based on this type of research, we thought a general purpose dataset summary needs to contain, so that people can actually understand whether they can use this data for their purpose. And I think in the context of environmental data, or specifically data about flooding, it would be interesting to understand how something like this could be extended to the specifics of dataset, of searching and using datasets about flooding. And just as an example of what you can do with such findings, is that we use this template to create a proof of concept prototype that kind of shows how such things could be translated into tool requirements. So this is just a kind of interactive questionnaire that guides the user to interact with the data set when they want to create a summary about it. And part of it is extracted automatically from a CSV file, and the rest is inputted by the person who's trying to describe the data set. But the point really is more that we think that if you want broader participation and engagement with data online, there are guidelines and there are recommendations out there from us and from lots of other researchers for the type of information you need to provide with a data set if you want it to be reused widely, or if you want people to engage with it. I'm going to move on to this second project I'd like to share with you. This was about sense making with data. So we really asked ourselves what happens when we look at new data. And for this, there were several studies involved, but the one I want to talk about is that we asked people to describe data verbally. So they did similar descriptions to what I just said, but they just talked about it, and we recorded them, and we looked at how they interacted with data, and partially was data that they brought to us, so something they were familiar with, and the other part was data that we gave them. In this case, it was a spreadsheet about the swine flu. And from that, we identified several related patterns of activities of how data users make sense of a new data set. The first one was inspecting. So really, this is just, imagine you open a spreadsheet to get a broad overview. You scan it, you scroll through it. If you work with code, you kind of print the headers and the first few rows. You try to understand its shape, its size. Essentially, people are trying to get a feeling for the data and the structure and what the columns mean. as a second pattern, people started to engage more deeply with the data to understand how trustworthy it might be, to judge if the details of the data match what you need, match what you already know. And this included also checking for errors, for relationships between columns in this case, for values in the data that kind of look strange or don't fit with the general distribution, or to really see if any parts of the data are missing or left out intentionally. And essentially they tried to find whether there's anything that might tell them that this data has to be used with caution, because for some of the tasks people want to do, data needs to be extremely reliable, and for others less, or in just very different ways. The third pattern that we saw in the kind of activities people did when engaging with the data set was we called placing, which I think is the most interesting or the least discussed in literature. So one thing that you do when looking at new data is you try to place it in relation to different contexts to kind of see how much it represents reality, or how much it represents what you need it to represent. So in that sense, we can say that data is always a snapshot of something. And the thing that people were trying to find out is it taking this picture, this snapshot of the right thing? Does it really show the right shot? And that includes looking at how the methods that have been used to collect the data in the first place have been applied. Do they make sense? Are they strict enough? Are they sound? Are there biases in the data that are relevant to you, or to what you want to do with it? Or does the data represent the norms, let's say, of a specific discipline that it comes from, that sort of influences or what it means, or that tells you what it means? So these are just some examples from a larger study. And so we kind of created this framework for the sake of being able to make design recommendations for data tools, and to sort of focus and design and development efforts and ground them in user needs of data consumers. Because, well, essentially there are many things that could be built, and we really believe there's still a large place for research in that area. But I think more interestingly, in the context of this event, I believe that thinking about how engagement with data happens in that way, and there are many other ways of thinking about this, but this is one, can kind of help to bring a perspective when it comes to communicating data with the public, and can help us to remember the different kind of questions people ask themselves as soon as they engage with data. Moving to the last project, this was really about how people reuse data and how they work together, and what we were interested in is how they're currently supported by tools in doing so. And these findings helped us to better understand teamwork with data, in that case in a non-data professional context, so more amateurs, and the motivations behind data use. But they also helped us to understand the barriers that exist for people to work with data at the moment. And I think one interesting thing about this study was that we framed collaboration with data on a spectrum that really goes from, you can create, collect, or publish data with someone else together. That would be co-creation. Imagine two people sitting in front of the same spreadsheet and filling it out together. But there is also a lot of, especially let's say in teams who work with data in everyday jobs, there's a lot of feedback on data, and there can also be a third-party discussion. But the one thing that we wanted to include in this spectrum is reuse of other people's data, because if really just want to emphasize, which is also part of a currently ongoing debate, that data doesn't stand for themselves, or it doesn't stand for itself, and that there is reuse of data requires a type of communication between the person who publishes the data and the person who uses the data. And in what form that is and in what timescale that happens is a different question, but you can't just expect people to use it as it is, and sometimes it's dealt that way. But to move on, we found 4 key user needs for data-centric collaborative work. And these were documentation, conversation, change control, and custom data access. This is in the collaboration literature. That's nothing new. These things are relevant for any type of collaboration, whether it's with data, with text, with code. But how that manifests itself in practice and in functionalities of tools might be different. So I'm going to spare you the detail, but documentation is really anything that tells us about the meaning of the data, but also about its life cycle. So when we say a creation strategy, we mean the kind of broader definition of the methodology of how a data set came to be, including its limitations and some caveats that might be attached to it. With conversation, it's really that any form of collaboration, as I said, also reuse needs a type of conversation and then different ways of supporting that through tools and channels. And the question is how we can make kind of tailor these channels to be more suitable to sharing and talking about data. So for example, people said they want to send each other data snippets. So that means like taking a screenshot of part of a data set and then being able to talk about that particular thing. And what happened is that a lot of people reported, and I know this from my own work, that when you work with data, they have kind of loads of different informal communication channels. And one is including sending screenshots of data sets via WhatsApp to being able to discuss them properly. But that's one thing. Moving on to change control, that is really just being able to track and access earlier versions of a data set, which is relevant, especially when the data is open and public, and is common in when we think about collaboration with text or when we think about collaboration with code, and it is increasingly realized for data, but it's tricky. Because there are relationships within the data set that might change. Yes. And with custom data access, I really think that's one of the most obvious and one of the most important points that kind of gets ignored a lot. And if we want people to actively engage with data, especially with data of public interest, the data needs to be accessible in different formats. It needs to be there in different level of details, catering to really the diverse needs that data consumers or data users have. And some need raw data, some need shapefiles, some need want a 3D database, but some just want visualizations that report data in a transparent manner that don't require digging into the data and making these analyses and all the considering all the influencing factors. And I think what we really need to be getting better at, especially with tool support, is translating data between different formats and different representations if we want a broader type of participation and if we want to include more people in that process. So tools can work on providing a wide range of mechanisms and of experiences to discover new data, to merge multiple data sets, because that's often what happens. And they shouldn't make strong assumptions about the technical skills of the user, both in terms of how the tool works, but in other ways also in terms of the type of language that we use. And there we come back to science communication. And really just to allow and to think, just make the point to think about how we can communicate and use and publish data so that it can be used with a minimum of technical skills and it can be more easily shared between different types of users. So I really think the opportunity about bringing such a perspective to work like this is in asking more and different types of questions potentially, and to think about how these questions apply for a project like this. And it would include questions like who is included, who are the users, who do we want the users to be, and can they actually access it, or is simply making data available and putting it online enough? Does it make it open? Does it really make it accessible? And the research we've done over the last couple of years told us like really not. And really had to think about how to cater to a multidisciplinary audience, which I think is challenging, but not just to people who have different skill sets, which is what I was focusing on now, but people who have different incentives, people who have different time commitments, different culture, and different interests. And in some sense, if we talk about science communication, also different, I think what is interesting thinking about different ways of communicating risk and uncertainty, because in some ways for us as scientists, it's completely normal to, like, we shouldn't or hardly ever make any statement that isn't attached to just a certain amount of uncertainty. Whereas if we think about how to communicate risk to individuals or to local communities, that might be very different discussions. And I know there is research in science education, and there is actually also research specifically about weather forecasting by a great researcher, I think a professor of psychology, Susan Joslin, who has talked about how people react in different types of risk communication in the media. Yeah, and I think last but not least, what I forget is I think such a project could ask the question, how do we choose which data stories to tell? How much context do we need? Who should be addressed? Is it a local or a kind of systemic level that needs to be reported? And I think this is where working together with people from various different audiences, even in such a project, it makes it interesting in the first place. Yeah, so I think to finish up, thank you for listening. Do you have any questions?